Hello everyone, I'm Lao Luong. In this video, we're kicking off Season 3 of the series, Forgotten History, Descendants of the Giants. If you haven't watched the first 2 seasons, you can find them on the channel. Before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. Feel free to leave your comments, I'd love to hear from you. After the Israelites left Egypt, they wandered for 40 years in the harsh, arid wilderness. During that time, they endured countless trials and suffering. But through these hardships, they were gradually forged into a united people, with one singular goal: to step foot on the land that God had promised them. Yet, strangely enough, as they approached the borders of the promised land, what awaited them wasn't peace, but a brutal, bloody war. So why, if this land was given to them by God, did they have to fight for it? Even more puzzling were the nations already occupying the land of Canaan. Like the Amalekites, Amorites, Hittites, and Philistines, who seemed possessed by a dark force, recklessly resisting this small, newly formed nation. Despite existing tensions and rivalries among these tribes, they suddenly joined forces, as if signing a pact of death, fiercely determined to block the Israelites at every turn. What were they so afraid of? Or, what were they protecting? As the war escalated, the Israelites began to realize the obstacle before them wasn't just the native peoples, but something else, a darker, more mysterious force hiding in the shadows. The truth behind this war was more ancient and terrifying than anything they had ever imagined. It was the descendants of the Nephilim giants, beings thought to have been wiped from the earth by the Great Flood, who had somehow survived, and were now manipulating the nations of Canaan from the shadows, silently awaiting the arrival of the Israelites. It was only then that the Israelites began to understand this was not just a conventional war, but a fateful battle that had raged for thousands of years. Why had the Nephilim returned? What secrets were they hiding? What connection did they have to this land? All these mysteries are waiting for us to uncover. As the Israelites set foot on this unforgiving land, they began to uncover a disturbing truth. Behind these seemingly ordinary tribes were remnants of the antediluvian age, the descendants of the Nephilim giants. These mysterious giant tribes were divided into 2 main branches, one called the Anakim, meaning the pure giants, and the other, the Rephaim, believed to be spirits of the dead, or perhaps the oldest giant inhabitants of this land. Strangely, none of these giant tribes were mentioned in the biblical genealogies, as if they didn't belong to human history at all. And yet, evidence of their existence is found everywhere. When the Israelites reached the eastern side of the Jordan River, they discovered a place called the Valley of Rephaim. Archaeological excavations there have revealed traces of these giants, with massive bodies, bizarre appearances, and features completely distinct from the ordinary Canaanite people. Historians and archaeologists have long tried to uncover the truth behind this mysterious race. For example, scholars like Knight and Lomas believe that the descendants of the Anakim, with their superior physiques and supernatural powers, quickly rose to dominate many of the Canaanite nations. In fact, in the cuneiform script of ancient Sumerian civilization, when referring to their kings, they often used the words giant or great one. All of these strange clues and ancient records completely challenge our traditional understanding of biblical history. Where did they really come from? Why were they never recorded in the Bible's genealogies, yet silently present throughout history? What does their existence truly mean? A feeling of both fear and curiosity struck the Israelites. They realized that the land they were entering was far more dangerous and mysterious than they had ever imagined. The true enemy in this war was not just the nations before them, but the ancient beings who had survived the Great Flood, hiding in the shadows, silently manipulating the course of history. The Nephilim, the ancient race of giants. But that was only the tip of the iceberg. The descendants of the Nephilim had already infiltrated tribes such as the Amalekites, Amorites, Hittites, and Philistines, rising to become the ruling class of Canaan. And this was no coincidence. In fact, it was all part of a meticulously planned conspiracy. They had long known that this land was the promised land, a sacred inheritance prepared by God for the descendants of Abraham. And because of that, They sought to use it as a means to defy the authority of the Almighty. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, it is written, "When God divided the nations, He reserved the land of Canaan for Himself, to be used in His divine plan. This land was a holy inheritance, meant to be given to the people of Israel. Any foreign nation that occupied it was destined to be driven out." However, let me make one thing clear. Is the Israel we know today truly the same Israel spoken of in the Bible? This is a deep question, and I'll be covering it in detail in a special members-only video on the channel. But now, back to the main topic. The descendants of the Nephilim deliberately violated that sacred boundary. Long before the Israelites ever arrived, they had quietly seized control of key strategic locations across the land. Driven by hatred toward God, they waited patiently, ready to strike at the precise moment when Israel would be weakest, most vulnerable to destruction. Some scholars believe that these giant descendants were seeking revenge for their ancestors, those who had been wiped out by the Great Flood, just as they once used violence and corruption to bring humanity to the brink of extinction. This time, they aimed to use the same tactics, to destroy God's plan for salvation once and for all. The giants occupied every strategic stronghold that the Israelites would have to face. They hid within fortified cities, using mysterious powers to manipulate the kingdoms of Canaan, inciting these nations to harbor deep hostility toward the Israelites, and vowing to forever block their path to the Promised Land. This conspiracy spanned centuries, as if it were a vendetta preordained even before the Great Flood. The Israelites were not merely confronting flesh and blood, but an ancient, hidden force that had lurked in the shadows for thousands of years. And behind it all stood the Nephilim. When the Israelites finally set foot in Canaan, they soon realized that two particular nations stood at the front lines of resistance: the Amalekites and the Amorites. According to the Bible, the Amalekites were descendants of Esau, the grandson of Abraham, meaning they shared the same bloodline. Yet strangely, in archaeology, there is no trace of the Amalekites. They appear as phantoms in history, as if they had never existed. Scholar Knight and Lomas have suggested that the Amalekites may have interbred with an unidentified ancient race of giants, giving rise to a mysterious hybrid people with terrifying power. The Amorites were equally astonishing. Known as the Amoru, they were once described as bloodthirsty, barbaric nomadic warriors, who long occupied the mountainous regions of Canaan. They ate raw meat, lived for war, and were even regarded by Mesopotamian civilization as nearly beast-like creatures. Both archaeological and historical records indicate that the Amalekites, early branches of the Amorites, intermarried and merged with native Canaanite populations, particularly with the Anakites and Rephaim. Over time, they evolved into a race of hybrid giants, whose mixed bloodlines allowed them to rapidly seize power. They eventually took control of the peoples of Canaan, transforming the entire region into a fortress, under the rule of the giant kind. Historian Lawrence Gardner once pointed out that after the Great Flood, humanity made an effort to re-establish royal authority. But that attempt quickly crumbled into chaos. Power soon returned to the hands of the giants. In the Sumerian king list, these rulers were described as those who descended from the heavens, and their reign was called the will of the giants. As a result, the lands ruled by the Amali and Amorites became central strongholds for expanding the influence of Nephilim bloodlines. With their enormous stature and superhuman strength, they easily subdued surrounding nations, building a nearly impenetrable line of defense. Now, the Israelites were forced to face two colossal forces bearing this ancient blood. Tribes that had lurked in darkness for millennia, brutal and shrouded in the mysteries of their lineage. The true battle was only just beginning. After the Great Flood, human civilization entered an entirely new era. Yet strangely, the flood did not mark the end of the giants' dominion. Gardner noted that in the early post-flood period, ordinary humans attempted to establish kingdoms on the ruins of ancient cities. But internal strife and failure caused these early kingdoms to collapse. Then, a new group appeared, the so-called ones who descended from the heavens. These were none other than the Nephilim, the pre-flood giants who had somehow survived. In the Sumerian king records, They were described as great men from the high realms, in other words, giants. With their extraordinary physical power, they swiftly conquered and dominated the new centers of civilization that arose after the flood. In Canaan, this dominance was especially evident. The leaders of the Amali and Amorite peoples were direct descendants of the Anakim and Rephaim. They ruled with absolute strength, establishing a royal hierarchy so formidable it endured for over 1.500 years. Once again, history quietly fell under the control of the Nephilim. But this raises a crucial question. How could the bloodline of the pre-flood giants have possibly survived? How were they able to so quickly rebuild an empire after such a cataclysm? Ancient Jewish texts and legends may offer some strange clues. The Babylonian Talmud explicitly states that the leaders of the giants were empowered and backed by the fallen angels, notably Azazel. In other words, these post-flood rulers were not entirely human. They were beings granted royal power by forces from the heavens. They did not merely rule over mankind. They were symbols of a cosmic rebellion that had begun long before the flood itself. Their empire, reborn from ashes, quietly spread through every corner of the land of Canaan. And now, the Israelites were about to face two legendary giant kings, the dark powers behind this entire dominion, Sihon and Og. This was their ultimate trial. As the Israelites pushed deeper into the heart of Canaan, they finally came face to face with the two towering monarchs of legend, Sihon and Og. Sihon, king of the Amorites, was a massive giant with a thunderous physique, yet he moved like lightning. According to Jewish tradition, his true name was Arad, a name meaning astonishingly swift. Some even speculate that this name hints at an ancient origin. Perhaps he was one of the few giants who escaped destruction before the Great Flood. When Moses led the Israelites to request safe passage through Sihon's land, the giant king did not hesitate to refuse. Instead, he launched an immediate and brutal assault. This act of aggression, seemingly ruthless, revealed a deeper purpose: to continue the ancient rebellion of the Nephilim, to set a deadly trap in the Promised Land, and stop the Israelites from fulfilling God's divine plan. But Sihon was not alone. There was another, far more mysterious and powerful: Og, king of Bashan, a land known in ancient texts as the realm of the Rephaim. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, Og was a unique giant among all giants, immense in size, possessing unparalleled strength, yet also strikingly handsome and a master of war. Og ruled over Mount Hermon, the infamous peak where the fallen angels once descended to earth and mingled with humankind. But Og's true identity ran even deeper. In Jewish legend, he was considered the last surviving giant from before the flood. Some even believed Og to be a direct descendant of the fallen angel Asael, a being who evaded both the flood and divine judgment. According to the Jewish book of Genesis, scholars Robert Graves and Raphael Patai recorded a shocking legend. During the Great Flood, Og clung to the outside of Noah's Ark, begging Noah for food and promising eternal loyalty to his descendants. But that oath did not last. After the floodwaters receded, Og returned to his old, wicked path. After the Israelites defeated Sihon, Og, the last of the giant kings, finally entered the battlefield. And yet, not even a titan like Og could escape destiny. In a climactic clash with Israel, he was utterly defeated. Strangely, the Bible never clearly states whether Og truly died in battle. It merely calls him the last survivor of the Rephaim, and places particular emphasis on his massive iron bed, over 4 meters long and more than 2 meters wide, as if it were an eternal mystery left behind for future generations. The fall of Sihon and Og, the last great giant kings, seemed to mark the end of an ancient empire hidden in the shadows for millennia. But was it truly the end? Among all records of the giants, 2 names stand out, shrouded in mystery and unlike any others: Abba and Rapha. These names are nowhere to be found in the official genealogies of the Bible, and yet they are unmistakably mentioned in ancient texts and tied to the names of real places. Abba was known as the greatest king among the Anakim, the mighty giants of Canaan. His name echoed with such renown that even after Israel entered the Promised Land, the city he founded still bore his name: Kiriath Arba, the city of Arba. known today as Hebron, one of the most famous cities in Israel. His origins are steeped in legend. According to Jewish tradition, Abba was not only the forefather of the Anakim, but also the biological father of Goliath, the infamous giant slain by David. And Goliath, in turn, had 3 giant sons, their names carefully recorded, yet never included in biblical genealogies, as if scripture deliberately avoided acknowledging this mysterious bloodline. As for Rapha, his name means the dead or the ancient ones. He is often considered the primordial ancestor of all Rephaim tribes. The books of Deuteronomy and Numbers mention several giant clans east of the Jordan River: the Emim, the Zuzim, the Horites, the Amorites, different names, but all referred to by a single title: the Rephaim, the mighty ones of the shadow. They were giants, each one towering in stature, countless in number, and possessing terrifying strength. So fearsome were they that even the Moabites and Ammonites trembled, giving them names rooted in terror. In their language, Mi symbolized fear, Zamzumim meaning the murmurers, the thunderers, beings whose voices roared like storms, echoing the might of mythical warriors from Atlantis or the Titans of old. To the people of Yahweh, they were called the unclean ones, a title full of warning and accusation. They once dwelled near the land of the Philistines, near Gaza, but were eventually wiped out by invaders from Kaftor, a mystery-shrouded people from the sea, though the nations called them by many names. The Bible clearly states they were all descendants of the Rephaim. And the Rephaim, according to the books of Numbers and Genesis, trace their lineage to a shadowy progenitor named Rapha. Their height rivaled that of the Anakim, the legendary giants. And like the Anakim, they were also classified as Rephaim, different names by different tongues, but their essence remained the same. Scholar Anger, in his research, proposed that the name Rephaim signified aboriginals, not wandering nomads nor foreign invaders, but beings who had inhabited the land since the aftermath of the Great Flood, perhaps even before it. Ancient records describe them as unlike any human: rough, hairy skin, eyes glowing like honey in the dark. Some bore serpentine skulls, radiating a strange luminescence. They were known as the Shining Ones. In ancient Egyptian lore, they were called phim, serpent-shaped men who could sense the fertility of the earth. This was no metaphor, no exaggeration, but a shared memory embedded in civilizations across the ancient world. A race that was not fully human, who claimed descent from the gods, who existed in the shadows between epochs. Behind the many names, Anakim, Rephaim, Zamzumim, Amorites, lies the trace of a forgotten bloodline: the Nephilim, a lineage that spanned both before and after the Great Flood. I don't believe they were merely legends. They once truly walked this earth, towering, violent, rebellious against the Lord. Every act they committed, and every end they met, was meticulously recorded by the people of Israel, from great battles to sacred psalms. But where did they come from? How did they survive the cataclysmic flood? And were they ever truly wiped out? I have no irrefutable proof. I only know this: their traces were never truly erased, only scattered, fading into the cracks of civilization. Blurred, fragmented, perhaps even deliberately concealed. If we dare to acknowledge the existence of these lingering memories, then the history we think we know may not be the history of mankind alone, but rather a cosmic war spanning epochs, disasters, and divine retribution. On this land we now call the Promised Land, it was never just humans vying to shape destiny.